Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Science Friday live stream for the book club. I am Diana Plasker. I am the book club captain and events and experiences manager for Science Friday. So I'm so excited to be joining you from cold upstate New York these days. It got a little cold now that it is January, but I'm so excited to be here with you all, no matter where you are joining us from. So, speaking of which, we want to know, where are you joining us from today? A few people have already started to let us know in the chat. If you are signed into YouTube using a Google account, you can join our chat. Let us know where you are joining from. I am seeing, let's see, people from Kansas, Sacramento, Davis, California, another San Francisco. Sun is shining. I love that. Madison, Wisconsin, Denver. Oh my gosh, so many people. I can't even keep up. Portland, Oregon, Kansas City. Thank you all so much for joining us. Keep letting us know where you are from in the chat. Well, if you don't know us, I like to say that Science Friday is your one-stop shop for all things science news. So you can find everything about Science Friday on our website, sciencefriday.com, of course. But we are most well known for our radio show, which airs from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern on, you guessed it, every Friday. You can listen on your local radio station or go to sciencefriday.com and click the listen banner that's at the top of our page. But today we are doing something a little bit different. We are talking about this month's book club pick. So like I said, run the Science Friday Book Club, and it is a monthly gathering of people all throughout the month reading one book together. And so each month we pick a different book. This time we read a book, and we are still reading, actually, it's only the 21st, John Vaillant's Fire Weather on the Front Lines of a Burning World. And if you want to join fellow readers to discuss this and other book club picks, you can do that on our community space hosted on Mighty Network. So you can go to our website, sciencefriday.com/book club, to find out how to join that book club and that community. It's a great community. Lots of people, I'm sure, are joining from that community today. And I'll post a link in the chat just a little bit to make it even easier for you to join us there. So a kind reminder before we get started. Science Friday is committed to providing a welcoming and harassment-free environment for members of all ethnicities, ages, gender and trans statuses, sexual orientations, physical abilities, national origin, beliefs, and any other dimension of diversity. We've created a code of conduct, which you can find in its entirety on our website, on our community space. And that helps us create a safe and positive community experience for all. I believe that providing clear expectations is a necessary part of building a respectful community. So here are the basics of our code of conduct. Be supportive and respectful when speaking with one another or asking questions in the chat. Share generously and listen closely. You can add your thoughts, ideas, questions throughout the conversation right there in the chat, even if they aren't strictly questions for our guests, although we do, of course, encourage questions to our guests, for our guests today. We're going to do our best to stay on topic as we are here to discuss this month's book club pick, again, which is fire weather and closely related topic. And we reserve the right to ban anyone who engages in demeaning, discriminatory, or harassing behavior in the chat today. All right, with all that, I think we are about ready to start. So please, in the chat, if you wouldn't mind putting your hands together for today's special guest. As you can probably guess, it is the author of Fire Weather, John Vaillant. Hi, John. Thanks for joining us.
Hey there. Greetings, everybody. Hi, Diana. So good
Hi,
to be with
John.
you.
Thank you so much for being here. Well, if you don't know him, John Vaillant is an author and freelance writer based in Vancouver, whose journalism explores collisions between human ambition and the natural world. He is the author of this month's book club pick, Fire Weather on the Front Lines of a Burning World, a deeply researched and poignant account of the 2016 Fort McMurray fire and an exploration of our rapidly changing environment with fire in a climate-affected world. John, thank you again so much for being here.
Yeah.
Well, let's just start off a little bit with the book itself. Can you just tell us a little bit, for anyone who hasn't read the book yet, what is the sort of elevator pitch for your book? What do you tell people if they've only got a minute or so, what it is and what inspired you to write it?
Well, it's a blow by blow of what happens when a wildfire breaks through the WUI, the wildland urban interface, and enters the city and sweeps through the city. And the case that I unpack in most detail is the case of Fort McMurray in 2016. Fort McMurray is the petroleum hub of Canada. It's located in northern Alberta in the boreal forest. It's a very industrial town of about 100,000 permanent and temporary workers. And on May 3rd, 2016, it was basically completely overrun by a massive wildfire that drove the largest, most rapid evacuation due to fire in modern times. And that includes LA. So, 80,000, 90,000 people were driven out in an afternoon. A firestorm really burned within the city day and night for almost a week, and caused, it's the most expensive disaster in Canadian history, and became a kind of template for a lot of these other terrible fires we've seen in Paradise, California, or Valparaiso, Chile, which you may not have heard of earlier this spring, LA, of course, Lahaina. There have been similar fires in Greece, in Portugal, and Spain, in Algeria. So this was in 2016 though. And so it was really just California and Australia that had fires like that. But because this occurred in the far north, on a latitude comparable to Alaska, and there was still ice on the lakes and rivers, when it occurred, I thought, my goodness, if a fire can burn with this intensity at that latitude, at that time of year, imagine what it can do farther south. And unfortunately, we've been discovering in subsequent years, this past decade has really revealed that to us.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned it, but let's start by just addressing the devastating fires that have been happening in LA and are still not under control. It's, things have ebbed and flowed over the last few days, but what are the parallels between this fire and the Fort McMurray fire that you detail in your book?
It's hard to imagine that there would be similarities because they're 200 miles apart in totally different ecosystems. Commonalities are a history of drought, especially recently. Other commonalities, a history of broken temperature records. Los Angeles had its hottest summer in the city's history. Planet Earth had our hottest year in the history of our species. So those are common. The other is flammable landscapes, the boreal forest, which is the massive forest system that runs around the northern hemisphere all the way across North America and through Russia and Scandinavia, is naturally flammable. Likewise, the chaparral forests or groves in Southern California are also naturally flammable. There's a fire season. It's part of how those landscapes manage themselves. What's new and what drove the Fort McMurray fire and drove the recent LA fire to such extraordinary intensity is the combination of intense drought, very, very low humidity. And that's something we should probably talk about. Is humidity is invisible, but it is really, when it's in very low percentages, single digits, low teens, it has an effect almost like gasoline in terms of enabling fire to spread with extraordinary speed. And so that's a common, I coined a term in fire weather, which is 21st century fire. And one of its sort of signal traits that we saw in Valparaiso and in Lahaina, in Paradise, in Fort McMurray, and in Los Angeles was the overwhelming speed and the intensity of the heat. And so these fires are unfightable when they really get rolling, and they also often result in larger systems, weather systems called pyrocumulonimbus clouds, which are puncture the stratosphere, turn the same way hurricanes do, and it can actually generate their own weather, including lightning that starts more fires 20, 30 miles away from the epicenter of the current fire. So they become self-perpetuation machines. And that's, the fires in Los Angeles are still burning 2 weeks later. The fire in Fort McMurray was not declared officially out until 15 months later. It smoldered through the winter. This is an Alberta winter. This is subarctic winters. smoldered in the roots and then reemerged in the spring. That's how, that's how dry it is now, and that's how determined fire is to keep oxidizing.
You talk a lot about this sort of determination and almost like you personalize fire a little bit in your book, talk about its motivations and almost equate it to the way that humans move about and have motivations through their life. Did that come to you naturally, or was that a choice that you made when describing the fire?
Boy, that was a really natural, gradual evolution. I think like most of us, fire is this thing very much outside us. You see it at the end of a candle, you see it in a fireplace, you see it in the forest. It's very hard to relate to. And so it was only after spending time with it and thinking about what drives it. And, it needs oxygen to function, to propagate and to grow. And so it's called a rapid oxidation event. You and I and all the listeners are also oxidation events. We just do it more slowly, but the same thing will happen to us. If you deprive us of oxygen, we've got, 90 seconds, a couple of minutes before we're, down and out on the floor. Do that to a candle or a wildfire, deprive it of oxygen, it will do the same thing. It will cool down, and the flames will disappear, the embers will eventually wink out, and it will die. And so there's this appetite in it because oxygen is, by its nature, so reactive. It's one of the most reactive gases. I think fluorine is more reactive, but oxygen is really volatile and really wants to kind of get in other people's business and let's make something happen here. And so you can really see fire wanting to do that, and it will burn, your COVID face mask or your napkin or your running shoe or a house, with equal zeal. And likewise, we are also very eager to keep going. We need to feed our bodies. We need to keep breathing. We resuscitate ourselves from suffocation about 20,000 times a day without even thinking about it. We inhale, take another breath that keeps us going, keeps us oxidizing. And so when I thought about that, and I thought about what happens to us if we're suffocated, we stop saying please and thank you, and we start to get much more basic, much more intent. Think of a drowning person climbing over another person to get air. And that's fire. It has no social niceties. It's not genteel. No one ever taught it any manners. It's just all appetite. And so it is a cardinal sin, really, to as a science writer, as a journalist, to anthropomorphize things that aren't people. And I ran into that with the tiger too, another book I wrote. But there's a lot that we know about tiger behavior and even tiger thought processes because they're higher mammals. And there's a lot that we know about fire because we observe it closely. We literally grew up with it as a species. There's never been a time in the life of Homo sapiens when fire wasn't somewhere in our neighborhood, if not right in our lives. And so we know it really well, and it's a way to use anthropomorphizing language, I think is okay as long as you draw the distinction. Like the fire doesn't want things in the way that we do, but it is compelled to react, and it is compelled to propagate itself. It's not satisfied just with burning the wick at the end of the candle. If there's a curtain hanging over the candle, it's going to light the curtain on fire too. If you spray hairspray at the candle, it's not just going to stay one little candle burning. You're going to have a spectacular explosion of flame. It will take what it can get. It will react to whatever is available to react with. So it's dynamic, and I think in that way, as I go through it in the book, it makes it more relatable, and it is a hunter. It won't just, it needs another leaf, it needs another stick, it needs another house to keep going, just as we need another meal. So, and because it's a rapid oxidation event, this process happens a lot more quickly. So it eats constantly. And yeah, the fact that, it can smolder underground, just barely alive for 6 months, it's almost like a bear going into hibernation and then reviving.
Yeah. I think a lot of readers found that comparison and the way that you anthropomorphize within your book, right? You're like you just explained, you weren't saying it's alive, it has thoughts and feelings and
Yeah.
processes,
Yeah.
but it helped sort of understand that process of the way that fire behaves, even if it doesn't have behavior.
I
So
hope
yeah, I
so.
think
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
a lot of readers were in our community space were really reacting to that and
So to
had
speak. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We have a few questions from our audience. Nizette had sent this one in advance. She asked, I'm interested in what drove you to write this book. Where did you start and what inflection points did you find along the way?
So I've written 4 books now, and I don't think I really chose any of them. They really came to me and wouldn't leave me alone. And so in May of 2016, I was actually at a writer's retreat working on a novel that had nothing to do with climate, nothing to do with fire. And I made the mistake of looking at my Twitter feed, and the city of Fort McMurray had disappeared. And in its place was this colossal charcoal colored smoke cloud that blotted out the entire city and everything around it. And I live in British Columbia, which is the neighboring province to Fort McMurray. And because it's the petroleum hub of the country, I mean, imagine if Houston caught on fire on that scale. You would be alarmed even if you lived in Massachusetts, like, my goodness, what is going on there? And nobody knew, because the cloud was so thick, nobody knew who was in there and who was getting out. So I was afraid. I was afraid for the citizens, fellow Canadians. I was just amazed that a city that was that wealthy and that proficient at controlling its own environment. It's a petroleum town. It's heavily industrialized. There are colossal amounts of heavy equipment up there because they're mining. They're not drilling oil. They're mining bitumen, which is basically tar-soaked sand that they then render with inconceivable amounts of natural gas to turn it into something that southern refineries, many of them owned by Koch Industries and similar, can turn into fuel. So Canada is the largest source of foreign imports into the United States. About 4 million barrels a day of diluted bitumen and related products come out of Fort McMurray into the United States every single day. So the idea that city, that the source of that could be incapacitated by fire, when that's really what its industry is. Like, petroleum is a fire product. The only reason we're interested in petroleum is because it burns, the energy that's latent in it. So there was an irony there, that was inescapable. And then there was a terrible disaster for 100,000 people. And we really didn't know for days who had made it out and who didn't. And so that, needless to say, kind of pulled me away from this novel, which felt suddenly inconsequential. And the more I looked into it, the more I came to read about how incredibly intense the fire was. The destruction was total, very similar to Los Angeles. There was literally nothing left. Metal was melting, glass was melting. And again, there was ice on the rivers at the time. There were car-sized blocks on the Athabasca River, which is a major northern river that descends into the Arctic Ocean. We're really in a different part of the globe there. And so it created a lot of dissonance for me that a place that cold and that tremendously wet, the boreal forest of the far north is the wettest biome on Earth, even wetter than the tropical jungle. And so that a place that spongy and water soaked, almost Everglades-like in places, could burn with that intensity, with a real world-ending intensity, generate its own pyrocumulonimbus cloud, 45,000 feet tall, sending out lightning, starting fires 20 or 30 miles away, that got my attention. And the more I looked into it, the more I thought, oh my goodness, this looks like a new regime. This is a new possibility on planet Earth. And 2 years later, there was the Redding Fire tornado in California, which I also reported on for The Guardian, and it is a chapter in the book. And that was an EF3 tornado made from fire. And that's never happened in the Northern Hemisphere. That is new for Homo sapiens. So that,
Yeah.
these are new terrors, and I could not ignore that.
Yeah. And you talk a little bit about, they're new because we're sort of living in a new world. And your book focuses
Yeah.
on, has a lot of running themes throughout it, but one of them, let's talk about the links between climate change and the increasing wildfire spread and intensity. What are some of those links that you make in the book?
Well, one of the striking things to me is how long we've known what CO2 is capable of. It's a part of our atmosphere. We generate it. I'm producing CO2 as I'm speaking to you right now. You're producing CO2, and wherever you're listening, and it's a natural part of how we live and what we live in. But Eunice Foote, a citizen scientist from upstate New York in 1856, figured out that CO2 in higher concentrations holds heat more effectively and takes longer to cool than normal air with a normal amount of CO2 in it. So she figured out that the heat retaining capacity of CO2, it's a greenhouse gas. They didn't have that language then, but she figured that out, 175 years ago, and it's just been part of the science, and it's become more urgent recently, and we know that when we light a fire, it generates CO2, and when we breathe, it generates CO2. When you run your car, a lot of things come out of the tailpipe, including CO2, and we now have close to 2 billion automobiles and related machines running on Earth right now. Humans burn roughly, I think it's 100 million barrels of oil and hundreds more millions of tons of coal every day. So that's colossal amounts of CO2. It's almost like if you were to gather that together, we ignite literally trillions of fires every day. I took the time, I counted them. And when you include individual combustions in the internal combustion engine, which powers our world, you get up to trillions of fires every day. And so when you accumulate that, when you gather that, aggregate it, you have the equivalent of basically a supervolcano. And we are basically a supervolcano of combustion. And that's what powers this incredible lifestyle that so many of us enjoy. And this is all happening, though, in a finite container. And as we say about Las Vegas, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, what happens in Earth's atmosphere stays in Earth's atmosphere. So everything we emit stays here. It does not dissipate up to the moon. It stays with us. And some of it is processed into the ocean. There's a huge amount of CO2 in the ocean right now. There's a lot of it in our atmosphere. Some of it is processed through limestone and rendered inert that way. Obviously, plants absorb it and convert it. So there are ways of processing it, but we're basically overwhelming the system. And so imagine, a flood, overwhelming your storm drain, or imagine a fire on your stove and the fan isn't managing it, so the smoke alarms go off and you're opening all the windows, and we got no windows to open here. So the alarms are going off, and weather is the alarm system.
You just made so many really poignant metaphors that I just want to call out. Our atmosphere is almost like a bell jar, right? The weather as an alarm system. I think these are ways that people haven't had to think about the system in which we live in a long time. And now, like you said, we're sort of being rudely awakened to some of the effects of the things we have known for 100, 150,
Yeah.
175 years.
Yeah.
We've got a great question from Fred in the chat that reads, U.S. network coverage of the LA fires never mentioned big oil as the, quote, real arsonists here. Will the
Yeah.
oil and gas industry ever be held accountable? You talk a little bit about this in your book, but sort of what do you see as the future of pointing the fingers at the places where they should be pointed?
So it's happening. Excuse me. It's definitely happening. Excuse me. I got a little cold when I was down south. I just came back from Southern California.
Yeah, thank you again for all the reporting you were doing out there.
And
A few of our members saw your interview on Sunday morning as well. It was another
oh,
really
right.
great, another great
Yeah,
example of
no,
some of
that
the
was
reporting you've been
there.
doing.
I mean, that's CBS, and they are mainstream network TV, and they talk to Peter Kalmus, also a noted climate scientist, and they are not shying away from this. But as far as will big oil be held accountable, there are thousands of lawsuits at various stages of advancement around the world right now, that are being pursued, prosecuted in order to hold big oil accountable. And I think the analogy that I see is, imagine when the first tobacco suits showed up, and I think that was in the 70s or 80s, and this was against an entity that had a lot of social license. And those of you who are older remember, you could smoke a cigarette on a plane, you could smoke it on a train, you could smoke it in the waiting room in a hospital, you could smoke them anywhere. And if you went to a bar, you would just come out stinking of smoke, and that's not what we do now. And when you have an institution like that that's very well funded and so well successfully and deeply integrated into society, when you start challenging it, it's got a lot of leverage to push back with. And so a lot of those first lawsuits against the tobacco industry were fought off successfully. And then eventually, as the tobacco industry started losing its social license, and lawyers got better and found themselves in front of different juries and different courtrooms, a couple of those cases were successful. And now we're in a really different place in our relationship to tobacco. And it's kind of like the 70s or the 80s now with the petroleum industry, which is even more deeply integrated into our society. And so in terms of social license, look around you, almost, 80 or 90 or if not 100% of the cars are powered by gas and oil. You're probably cooking and heating with it. Many of the objects in your house are made from it. Everything in our world that we interact with is at some point mediated through fire's energy, either, created by it or somehow engaged with it to get it to us or to make it. So therefore, to then turn around and say, hey, this is actually really quite terrible for our health and well-being. You have this very entrenched industry, the petroleum industry, and all of its kind of ancillary, the automobile industry, the plastics industry. None of these folks want to go out of business. And what I realized after 7 years of working on this book is that the petroleum industry is a fire industry. It cannot exist without burning. And so they understood that when they started looking into the petroleum industry's, their own industry's relationship to CO2 back in the 70s and 80s. The Exxon did some of the best climate science that has been done, and they predicted accurately where we would be now. And that is really alarming. Using 1970s science, Exxon company scientists, this was not a separate outside independent, these were the company scientists plotted out where we would be climatically in terms of how many parts per million of CO2, where our temperature would be, and they nailed it just about right. And they knew that this would impact weather. They wrote about it. The documents are all there. So that is alarming. And so what do you do if an industry knows what it's doing and then tries aggressively to cover that up? And we're still in that phase, this sort of now almost 50-year-long process of covering up, obfuscating, denying, offering alternative theories. And now, that is official policy. As of yesterday, that's official policy in the United States. It's official policy in Alberta. Alberta is, completely, the government is effectively captive to the petroleum industry. And so they will just push whatever message they want to say, and the science says different. And that has been understood since way before this became a partisan issue or a health issue or a legal issue.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about so the our community expressed frustration and even a little bit of despair when reading, the ways that climate change have created this so-called Petrocene, as you put it,
Mhm.
that we're sort of living through now. There are challenges, though dire, but we're not without hope. Over the last
Yeah.
25 years, and at the end of the book, you talk a little bit about this, and you just spoke about some of the lawsuits and class actions that are happening against some of these organizations and these
Yeah.
individuals. What are some of
Mhm.
the greatest global or community level wins to address living with and mitigating wildfires?
Oh boy, I mean, we should almost do a whole show on that,
We
Diana.
could,
There
honestly.
is so much happening right now, and one I look at is the case of Paris, France. This is one of the great cities of the world, certainly a real kind of not a milestone, but a real reference point, trendsetter, cultural touchstone for the Western world and for a lot of the rest of the world. And it has been shrouded in smoke and choked with traffic for 100 years. And everybody just assumed that's the way Paris was. It stunk of diesel, the traffic was insane, and the air, was really terrible. Well, Mayor Hidalgo, in I think maybe 1.5 terms, like I'm not sure how many terms she's had, but she is changing in real time the nature of that city and what happened. And because we grew up in it, we didn't see it happen. But cities originally were built for people to congregate in, to move around in, to engage in commerce in, to gather together, to celebrate in. And cars took it over. And cars now, the footprint of cars between roads and parking have really taken it over and made it much more dangerous. Every city now is like that. And Mayor Hidalgo is in the process of returning the city, the great boulevards of Paris, back to cyclists, pedestrians, mass transit, which every city in the United States used to have. 100 years ago, you could ride by electric trolley from town to town, basically from Boston to Chicago and beyond.
What a
And
dream.
it really is a dream. And it was electric. 100 years ago, we could do that. We did that. And the petroleum industry, the tire industry, the automotive industry, offered another product and pushed hard and replaced the mass transit with what we have today. And so Mayor Hidalgo and many other mayors of cities and towns of different sizes are starting to reclaim parts of their cities, parts of their towns for pedestrians. And so that creates a safer place. It's great for commerce. And it also really improves the air. So if you look at the air over Paris 15 years ago and today, it's really like night and day. And so much healthier in so many ways. So that would be one in terms of, and then when you look at the energy transition that is underway right now, it's not happening the same way the smartphone happened. Whereas, in 2006, nobody had them. And in 2008, everybody had them. And 2010, sixth graders had them. It's going to take longer with electrification because the grid is so massive. The petroleum infrastructure is colossal and frankly beautifully engineered. And this is something that we should all pause. And it's very tempting and in some ways justifiable to rag hard on the petroleum industry, but they made the world that we have today. And I think it would behoove all of us to take a moment and count all the ways that petroleum has improved our lives, enriched our lives, and touched us personally in positive ways, because it's a massive. I've made the list myself, and it's massive. And they designed this incredible infrastructure that means that the only reason you run out of gas generally is because you forgot to fill up your car. The gas is always there. And that is a real accomplishment. And it's individual people who make that happen, from the person pumping the gas to the person on the oil rig. And so those are people who did that, for us, you could say, and for a paycheck. But so what that also says to me, if we can do it with gas, which is a very clumsy, dirty, explosive, toxic substance, we sure as heck should be able to do it with electricity. And given that the sun and the wind and the oceans are bottomless sources of energy, providing, more energy than we could possibly use in 1,000 lifetimes, if we can harness it, there's no reason we can't take the expertise of the petroleum industry and apply it and so this is happening. The short version is, we are in an energy transition right now. It's not going back. It really doesn't matter who the president is. It doesn't. That can have local impacts, but the petroleum industry is on the wane. It knows it is, and it's squeezing every last dollar out while it can. And I think it will always be with us. It's too good a fuel. It works too well to give up entirely. Coal will always be with us. And I think what we'll see is just a shift in ratios. And, in China right now, the speed with which they are laying on gigawatts of renewable energy, would make your head spin. It's just on a scale that North Americans can't even imagine. And interestingly, Texas, one of the heartlands of the petroleum industry, a red state, is leading not just the nation but the continent in renewable energy construction and generation. They're way ahead of California, and you wouldn't think that. If you asked me, I would say, well, it would be California or maybe New York or something like that. But South Dakota, I think they get 86% of their electricity from renewables.
Amazing.
South Dakota, is not, a land of tree huggers. There are no trees to hug there. No, I'm kidding. But it's not a place that's famously liberal or environmentally vocal, and yet they've reached a degree of integration with renewable energy that a lot of the rest of us can only envy. And so that's impressive. So there are many other wins just in terms of the change in consciousness. So I drove across the country, the U.S., about a year ago, and I just did it now to go see my dad in Southern California, and happened to overlap with the fires down there. And I saw so many more electric vehicles this time. And just anecdotally on the highway, like there was almost no time. There's a lot of traffic out there, and there was almost no time when I couldn't see at least one or two electric vehicles somewhere on the road with me, not just passing the other way, but sharing space with me on the road. So that means there's a lot of electric EVs out there, and there are many more in other countries. So we're in a period of transition. This is probably a decadal or generational transition. It's not happening fast enough. We definitely squandered some precious years, and we're going to pay for that in some painful ways. And LA is having that experience right now. North Carolina, the southeastern U.S., has really suffered recently. So that's baked in. But we're moving a very clumsy and enormous organism into a new energy regime, but also it's a new consciousness. All of us were raised in the Petrocene age. For all of us, gas and oil are normal. The smell is normal. The way of interacting with it is normal. The way that we don't even see it or notice it is normal. It's so integrated. But when you really start looking at it, and you realize, my goodness, this stuff is poison. Every step, the moment it leaves the ground, it becomes toxic. The fumes, the liquid, it's explosive. It's not a perfect energy by any stretch of the imagination. And that's where, electricity, especially renewable electricity, really has the advantage. And, we're in tension now between an old industry, an old regime that is fighting for its life, and a new world that is trying to emerge.
We have so many great questions from the audience I'm going to get to in a second, but I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about something you just said a few times, which is like we're surrounded by petroleum products. And one of the other themes that sort of runs throughout your book is this idea that our homes in particular are made of so many more petroleum products than they used to be. And so that's also fueling this massive spread of wildfires, but also the decimation. I mean, you describe people describing the Fort McMurray fire, where a house would be there and 5 minutes later it would be gone, like fully gone.
Yeah,
Something
yeah.
people had never seen before. So, how is that's just one way that the way we surround ourselves with petroleum products has changed. But can you just talk a little bit about the specifics of that? I think that a lot of people in our community were really awestruck by that fact.
Yeah, it's we really don't see it, and again, this is something we owe the petroleum industry a debt of gratitude, and we owe the engineers who mediate the relationship between us and petroleum a debt of gratitude, and that's why we can ride together in a car, not be gassed to death, and not go deaf from the engine noise. But if we were to bring an engine onto the show and interview it, it would be deafeningly loud, and whoever's house it was in, it would poison them. It would gas them to death in half an hour. And so these are really toxic and violent machines that have been kind of brought to heel and suppressed. And so that's just one example of the way we've been enabled not to see what these things are and what they do and the impacts they have. And CO2 happens to be conveniently invisible. But as far as the insides of our houses, if you think of plywood, is full of chemical glues. And if you think of vinyl siding, firefighters call that solidified gasoline. Starts to melt at 165 degrees, and then it starts to off-gas. And what it's off-gassing are volatile vapors. And your furniture does that too. So in the modern, IKEA living room, all the upholstery is synthetic. The stuffing is synthetic. Your mattress, which is supposed to be fireproof if you drop a cigarette on it, will burn spectacularly when it really gets up to temperature. And so there's a video which, if you want to sober yourselves, is easily seen on YouTube. If you look up UL as an underwriter's laboratory, look up UL living room fire test, and it will show what happens. Show how a legacy living room, basically wooden furniture, cotton upholstery, horsehair or cotton batting for the stuffing, a wool rug, lace curtains, grandma's house, how that burns in comparison to the modern living room, which is all synthetics and laminates. And basically, so they start two fires in the sofa in these parallel rooms, and things, the modern room starts to generate black smoke very, very quickly. And at the 3-minute and 20-second point, when grandma's house still has just a fire on the sofa that you and your grandchild could put out together with a bucket of water, the modern living room explodes into flame like a refinery fire. And that is because they're petroleum products, and they look stable when you're sitting on them, but when they heat up, they begin to off-gas. And what they're off-gassing are these volatile vapors. So think of the way a gas can explodes. That's what rooms turn into. And that's why houses in Fort McMurray, vinyl windows, tar shingle roofs, vinyl siding, everything synthetic and rubber and plastic inside, exploded into flame and burnt to the basement in the time that you could smoke a cigarette. And that, it's shocking, and it's extremely dangerous, and it's much more likely now because of the intensity of the modern fire, of the 21st century fire.
Yeah, and so Earl mentions this thing that you bring up in the book as well, that one of the ways that the firefighters were
Yeah.
trying to mitigate these fires, another new way of doing things was knocking down homes to create fire breaks between on fire homes and the untouched as yet so far parts of
Yeah,
neighborhoods. So how
yeah.
was unique was that to the Fort McMurray fire?
It had been done in British Columbia during a really terrible fire in 2003. That was one of the first of these kind of modern urban conflagrations, and it was relatively small by modern standards. I think, Earl, why you are unlikely to see that in the United States is because the U.S. is so famously litigious. The idea of people bulldozing brand new houses, as they did in Fort McMurray in their hundreds, would just backfire in all kinds of horrible ways, and also might not work. What happened in Fort McMurray? This was after 3 days of resounding defeats, night and day, losing neighborhood after neighborhood. This fire in Fort McMurray, similar to California, to LA, burnt day and night, aggressively spreading. That's another feature of 21st century fire, is aggressive nighttime growth. That didn't used to happen so much. So this fire is in Fort McMurray has been doing this for 3 days straight now, and water was not working. Nothing was working. And finally, some kind of out of the box volunteer construction guys said, hey, what if we just start bulldozing these things? Let's create a fire break through the neighborhood. And what they were really trying to do, Earl, is they were trying to lower the flames. And so a house, a 30-foot tall house on fire makes 90-foot flames. A house in a heap of kindling in the basement makes 15-foot flames, and that makes fewer embers, fewer ash, less hazard for the firefighters trying to put the fire out. So they tried that in one neighborhood, and they managed to save that local part of the city, but the fire did not stop by any stretch of the imagination. And so whether it was successful or not, it really depends on your calculus. And it was extraordinarily dangerous to do because you had firefighters, you had heavy equipment operators who are not firefighters, who didn't have protective gear, in the middle of a firestorm, bulldozing houses down and bulldozing the cars and into the basements. And it's an incredible scene, and it's takes up a chapter in fire weather. And I was just astounded when these guys told me about what they had been up to that night. And really kind of unheard of, and terrifically brave. It sounds kind of insane and counterintuitive, but it made sense. But they are in a world where all the laws are being broken and violated. The fire is now, it's a fire planet effectively that they're living in. And that's what firefighters had to deal with in Los Angeles too. Fire and wind were the dominant energies that controlled what happened. And people were really just passengers in this event. And as a number of firefighters told me who had been through events like this, they say the firefighting effort turns into a life-saving effort. That's really all you can do, is try to get as many people out as you can, because the heat being generated, especially when the winds whip up, the fire hose water won't even reach the fire. It will simply evaporate and go up into the fire cloud and possibly even energize the pyrocumulonimbus cloud. And likewise, you can't bucket or fly effectively over these really raging fires because the airs are so unstable. Obviously heat rises, so it's incredibly hot up there. If you drop too high, it's all going to dissipate and evaporate. If you go too low, the winds are buffeting and there's still so much energy, you could have a terrible accident with the airplane. So those pilots that we saw working the fire in Los Angeles, it's probably harder than being a fighter pilot. Those are the best pilots in the world, coming out of Canada and the US, helicopter and airplane. What they're doing, the airs are so unstable, the terrain is so dicey, and the fire is so unforgiving. They're really, it's heroic work they're doing, and, they're getting better at it all the time. But, when the fire is really going, there really isn't much you can do, but knocking houses down was kind of a last ditch effort. And I don't
Yeah.
expect it to catch on.
Yeah, and so there's the danger of the fire itself, right? But then we have this question from Lacey. What I really worry about now, like there's the after effects, right? The fire retardant spray we put on mattresses, furniture, but also the kinds of things that are dropped on fires that don't react to water, these fire retardants. doesn't that also off-gas horrible stuff into the normal atmosphere?
So Lacey, there are all these kind of layers. Once something ignites, it sets off a whole cascade of effects. And one famously in California, but also in BC and Alberta, after the forest fire, the land is much less stable, and then you have landslides and all kinds of terrible washouts. Meanwhile, so that's a more remote side effect, but the more immediate one is the smoke. And smoke knows no boundaries. You got a lot of our smoke in the United States during the terrible Canadian fires of 2023, the worst fires in Canadian history. And the CO2 emitted just from those fires was 3 times what Canadian humans and industry emits annually. And so embedded in that smoke, along with P2 particles coming out of the forest, which are really bad for your lungs, is this hideous kind of aerosol cocktail of the burning home. And there's just an extraordinary number of substances in your house that, once they become aerosolized, are really bad for you to breathe, and including all the stuff they put on your mattress to keep it from lighting if you fall asleep with a cigarette. But that stuff, I think, is actually bad for you even when it's not burning. And what firefighters are finding is that their bunker gear, the protective gear that they wear into a fire in municipal fire situations, is toxic. So there are lawsuits and health issues. And what I learned from the Fort McMurray fires, firefighters who fought that fire basically in this petroleum haze for weeks on end, is that all of them are pretty much resigned to the fact that their lives are going to be shorter now and much less healthy. And so these are, again, this is the petroleum industry endangering the people who, in a way, most of us trust the most, need the most. These are first responders who are going where the rest of us are afraid to go or not qualified to go, and trying to keep us safe, trying to keep our stuff safe. And they're the ones who are taking the brunt of these gas clouds of toxins. And so I think that's going to be an issue for the LA firefighters too. And it's one thing if it's a house fire and you put the thing out in 6 hours and it's just one house, but if you have 1,000 houses or 10,000 houses, you just blew up a refinery, and you blew up a chemical plant. You blew up a whole bunch of different plants and spread them all over the landscape. So that's something we haven't really reckoned with yet. And that is, a really, really important, though less visible side effect. And that's going to be with us. And the same way responders to 9/11, the attacks on the Twin Towers, they had a whole variety of health impacts from being around just the clouds and the dust from those buildings. There's something called Katrina cough that first responders to Hurricane Katrina encountered, again, because so many parts of the city were destroyed or burning or rotting or broken loose, that there was this toxic soup that they were wandering around in. And there's an analogy to those in these fires. And so it's our first responders, but also the citizenry who are going to, be bearing the brunt of that.
It reminds me too of the effects of climate change, right? It's the people who are in the places where they can make the most change that sometimes aren't doing the change that they need to do. And it's the people who are the most affected often by climate change are the ones who aren't making these decisions or aren't in positions to be polluting
Right.
as much as the others, right? So
Yeah.
it's a fair comparison, and it's scary.
And what you raised there too is this really is a social justice issue. Climate change really is about caring for people and its impacts on people, and all of us are vulnerable. And you can be a billionaire, but your house in Nantucket can still get shrouded in smoke for days on end, and that means it's not just P2 particles from the forest, but you're breathing in all those chemicals. And there's only so much an N95 will do, and do you want to spend all summer wearing an N95? And what kind of world is that? We have this actually quite beautiful, still functioning world, and the petroleum industry and its really amazing products that we love to use, and in some cases need to use, but there are alternatives now. But this is pushing us into a less safe world. So this substance that empowered us in so many ways, enriched us in so many ways, improved our lives in so many ways, there's starting to be some blowback to that, and there's a price to that, and we're paying it now.
John, I could talk to you about your book all day. Thank you again so much for coming on this live stream and chatting with our volunteer, our community about this. Before I let you
Yeah.
go, though, I have one question from Kim that I want to raise. They ask, is there anything communities can do to lessen fire risk? You're talking about these big industries that, individuals may not have as much of a impact on, but what can we do in our community spaces and,
Yeah.
hopefully leave us with a little bit of something that we might leave this conversation
Oh yeah.
with.
No,
If
there's
you can.
really, I couldn't have written this book if I was a doomer. And I have children, and I have aspirations for them and for myself and for all of you. And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that we can pick in our communities. And this really depends on where you live. But first of all, so again, I talked about this change in consciousness, and we need to think about our environments, whether we live in Colorado or upstate New York. They are all more flammable now. And so we need to open our minds to the possibility, well, where I live has never burned before, but that doesn't mean it can't burn now. And so what are some things that make my house more flammable that I can change? And so like right outside my window is this huge yew tree. It's a conifer tree. They're really flammable. They burn a lot of houses down when they catch on fire. So shrinking that, either cutting it down or pruning it, is one way to reduce that. Another, if you're re-roofing and you're living in a really flammable place like California, I would recommend tiles or metal versus tar shingles or cedar. In terms of other fire safety, there in Canada we have what's called Fire Smart. I know there are community, there's state fire services and municipal fire services have the equivalent to a Fire Smart program in which you can contact them and say, will you come and visit our neighborhood, come and visit our cul-de-sac, come and visit our neighborhood watch community, come to my backyard and help me look at my space through the lens of fire and flammability. We're not used to doing that. But if you think about, if you had a terrible drought and all your grass was brown and it was late August and you went to have a cookout, you would probably handle that cookout differently, or you certainly should, and you might not even have the cookout. You might wait till a more damp time of year. And so we are going to need to change our behavior. And then, the other thing besides kind of global decarbonization, which has to happen, it is going to happen one way or the other, is to, depending on how active you want to be, there are ways to decarbonize in your own life. In terms of heat pump is among the lowest hanging fruit you can pick and among the cheapest in terms of changing your heating regime that will also cool your house and use electricity instead of gas or oil. That's a really big one. And these are, cumulative. What we really need is policy, but the market drives a lot of policy. And if there's a market for heat pumps, which there is, and they are proven to be effective even in really cold places like Norway and Alpine Colorado, this will move the needle. So there's I could kind of go on and on, but those would be some. But obviously to electrify as much as possible, and to again just think about, wow, if I was a fire, what would I ignite off of in my living space, and then start thinking about, okay. And the other last thing I'll say is you can make your own homemade sprinkler system with a garden sprinkler. And you could literally make a water curtain over your house. I have one of those oscillating sprinklers. I have a hose that reaches up to my roof, got a hammer and a couple of nails. And if there are embers falling, if there is fire predicted coming over, I can nail that to the roof and fire it up. It's pretty water conservative, and it will douse any embers. Most embers that land, it will not stop a firestorm, but it will douse errant embers. It will also reach to the neighbor's property. And so if you had a community that was thinking that way, you would stand tens of percentages better chances of making it through a fire. So, and that's really just the beginning. So it's really at the thinking about how we live and its flammability in a different way is the first big step.
I think by writing this book, you have encouraged a lot of our community members to think differently about fire in their world. So thank you, John, so much for joining us for this conversation and for writing this book. And thank you all for joining us and reading this with the Science Friday Book Club. So, John Vaillant, thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.
Yeah, thanks, Diana. And yeah, what a pleasure and what an honor, really, to be on the legendary Science Friday. So really glad to be with you all, and stay in touch.
Yeah, we appreciate your time. Everyone, thank you again for joining us. Next month, we're still reading this book. It's not quite the end of January yet, so we're still reading Fire, Weather on the Front Lines of a Burning World by John Vaillant. But next month, we are reading a book called Origin by Jennifer Raff, and it's all about the new science around finding out how people came to North America and the Americas at large. So we're really excited.
Great.
Yeah, it's exciting. Yeah, we're really switching it up next month. So John,
Nice.
I hope you'll join us for that book club.
Hey, yeah, no, it really sounds interesting. No, I mean, this is my wheelhouse, the kinds of the books you read and the way you talk about it. I love it. So yeah, great
Thanks,
to be
John.
part of it.
And yeah, thank you again. Everyone, have a lovely rest of your day. And thank you for joining us for the SciFri Book Club pick. We'll see you next time.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.